My wife got sick last minute, so I apologize, everybody. I can't be there in person tonight.
However you can do it, glad you can be with us, Jesse.
Ready to go. I'm here.
I'm here. I'll second.
Yes.
Yes.
This conference will now be recorded.
Yes. Can you hear me or no? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Jim Blair, would you mind speaking to the mic? Having a hard time hearing you too. I'm sorry. Hey, Jim, would you mind turning on the mic that you're speaking into? Because we're still having a hard time hearing you. Sorry. Gotcha. We're good. Thank you.
Um, I had a couple questions, Jesse. So I know that the city's signage that we have downtown has message restrictions. I know that you guys might have said this, but I couldn't hear exactly. So this one, if we approve the variance, it'll still fall under um, whatever limitations are. Do we have coded limitations for the signage downtown? Would it fall under any other code, or uh, I guess just give me a little background on um, do we have on current code that this would fall under if for the variance or system that we have to monitor. And besides, I know you said Jim, they would submit a message every 30 days, but um, do we have like the what's our standard? Do we have any standard policy for background and types of messaging? Okay. I'd like to make one suggestion that um, since we're passing new zoning ordinances that and this electronic signage will probably be included in some of the language of our new code. If we approve this, I would like to make the approval conditioned on that it would that it would come in compliance with the new code as passed. Um, so when we do come up with a reasonable standard for this community wide, that this would not be a grandfathered in situation. So then it would be compliant, even though it was built before the code passed, that it could be in compliance with whatever reasonable standards we do pass the new code. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. I didn't know if that was an option, so that's fine.
All that verbiage is in the new part of the code that we haven't gotten to yet because signage literally took about 6 meetings last time we went over it. It is a lot of discussion goes into that. So I guarantee you it's in the next version.
Bailey, would a current sign, even though it's already built, with the new programming, future programming, would that fall under the new code as passed?
I was just going to throw out a couple questions if everybody else was done. So currently, how many colors is this? Looks like a pretty dynamic type sign. I would imagine it's going to have probably the whole range of color options, correct? Yeah. Well, okay, that makes sense. So just to give some context to how I went through this application and what was reviewing the different parameters that are in question this evening. I'm not looking at it against any future code. I'm looking at it as the code stands now. And I'm looking at it relative to the other similar type signs that we have in place right now with respect to precedents and what's already out there. For me, and I'll go through the practical difficulty questions with respect to the variance piece of it. First and foremost, the variance itself is specific to the fact that internally illuminated signs aren't allowed in the SR1 district, which the church is zoned as an SR1 district right now. Really, the biggest baseline against all of this is the precedence that I think that this would set with allowing this type of sign in a residentially zoned area. And if there is concern that the church is not zoned appropriately, then I think that's maybe the standard from which the conversation starts. And once it is zoned appropriately, if it's moved from an SR1 to a different type of zoning district that allows this type of sign, then I think we remove ourselves from setting a precedence with a variance that could influence just allowing this type of sign in residential areas carte blanche, or we stick to how the code is written right now and allow it in the correct district for which it's being proposed, provided it moves from a residential to whichever. So I wanted to put that out there, that is a baseline for me, and it's going to be hard for me to move from that. Relative to that, maximum number of colors in the SR1 district is 3. I just was curious about that. Maximum total square footage in all signs in an SR1 is 6 square feet. I don't know if that really applies here, because you're really taking the place and just replacing for what's there, which is about 6 times that size anyway. But, excuse me, relative to the practical difficulty questions, I really don't see where this meets any of those that would make this variance allowable in my perspective. I think the property still has a reasonable return without this. I think that the variance is substantial because it sets a precedence for this type of sign in a residential area. Does it have an adverse effect on the neighborhood? Maybe, maybe not, just depending on who is, the homes that may be around it. And I know we were talking about how it is illuminated, at night, which may affect the surrounding environment. It would not adversely affect the delivery of government services. Doubtful that, this was even a conversation when the property was purchased or zoned about this type of sign being used. Can the predicament be feasibly obviated through some other method than a variance? And I think that's the zoning designation, if we think the zoning designation isn't accurate with an SR1. And then the last one, whether the spirit and intent behind the zoning requirement would be observed and substantial justice done by granting the variance. Reading the first part of the zoning code with respect to safety, aesthetics, scenic, the scenic aspect, and accidents. Another concern that I had just as a byproduct is how dynamic this sign might be relative to a designated school zone at particular time. So if it's a static copy that's changed over 24 hours, maybe that's not as much of a concern. But knowing that that's a school zone and this may be a little distractive, I'd be remiss if I didn't call that out. So for me, it's kind of difficult. Signs are difficult, but I think it sets a precedence with allowing this type of sign in a residential district, which to me then says that if this area isn't zoned properly, then maybe we go back and look at moving it from an whether it's valid to move it from an SR1 to something else to make it allowable. And Jim, I feel like you're speaking for the applicant here when I'm addressing my questions to them. I appreciate your opinion and I appreciate your point of view. By no means, I'm certainly aware that churches are allowed in most every zoning district that we have. And I'm not saying anything against the sign and how nice it would be coming into the village. And I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with the fact that our zoning code is or isn't up to date. I think by sheer fact that we're updating it tells it that it's probably a little bit out of date. But the fact that it's not updated to where we are talking about it now and that what we have in front of us is why we're entertaining a variance, that if we want this to change sooner rather than later, then we change the code that we have right now rather than continuing to approve variances that make a new norm. That being said, however long it takes us to approve the new code as it comes down the pipeline, is the time that somebody else would have to come in and apply for a sign of this similar nature in a residential district, to which a precedence would already be set. So I don't think it's any fault of the churches. I think it's just a fault of the state of the environment as it is right now. But I think it's a simple baseline change. If you need to update the zoning, I think that looks at alleviating a lot of the issues relative to needing a variance in the first place, which by its definition is a deviation from the standard that you already have. If you have standards that you continue to change, then the change becomes the standard. So I don't think that's where we want to be relative to variances, in my opinion.
I've got a question. Jim, if this was in UR1, would the illuminated sign be allowed, and would the size they're proposing be allowed? I share Ben's concern that this would set a precedent. I understand it faces the street, but there's a whole lot of houses going up and down the road there that then could say, or businesses too, they could say, well, you allowed it to the church, why can't we do the same thing? That's my concern here.
Yeah, just to reiterate, I don't have anything against the sign itself or the idea of having a sign there. It's the precedence that it sets. So I think the sign is great. I think it matches a lot of the other signs that we have in town. It's just the fact that it's a sign request. It's in a residential area. It's just I just can't get there from a setting a precedent standpoint. If it was UR1, internal illumination signs are still not permitted. Ron, just FYI. And not to further the conversation, but right across the street, or to deviate here, right across the street in the future land use map on the other side of Concord, that strip is listed as commercial in the future land use map. It's outside of the village. It's in the township, but we have it listed as commercial on the future land use map. So I'm just putting it out there.
And I would just want to say one thing too, along those same lines, with the passage of the new future land use map, that I think it's important that we progressively encourage parcels to update their the zoning district that they're in as as fits the new needs and the new design. So I think this is a perfect example of an opportunity that we have to change the zoning district to better fit the future land use map and better fit the current usage of the property. I think that from where it sounds like everybody is on this project, I would like to encourage the applicant to apply for a rezoning for the parcel and maybe apply for the new sign variance after we get the new code updated, because that will give us some more time to develop standards that are appropriate for the village. And they don't have, that's not no requirement, but I would say that that's just a personal recommendation I'd like to throw out there before we vote.
But Jesse, I don't think a variance would be needed if they were to rezone to, say, for example, a GCC district. If it's allowable, then it's allowable. And if it meets, similar criteria to our future land use map, then that would make sense. If it were to conform to all the other requirements, the sign application, I think, has already been submitted. It would just be a matter of having the conversation around updating the zoning for that particular parcel.
Agreed. I stand corrected. That's a good point.
Hey, Louis, just wanted to point out there, because you're absolutely right. I made a list of all the other locations within the village that have similar types of signs. But again, from a precedent standpoint, all of those other locations are in GCC districts. This is not. So that is the main difference, not the type of facility or not the specific use of the property, but the location and the current zoning of the district.
I believe that's right. This is Yaz. Can you guys hear me? Great. Yeah, this looks like the section for preliminary plats. Am I seeing that right? Zoning ordinance variances. Jim, if you could go back one. Oh, right. No, you're good right there. If you see right there, zoning ordinance variances is located in chapter 1133, planning and zoning chapter. I think that's the section that applies for something like this. Yeah.
Can Louis go to the mic? I can't hear. I'm sorry. Mr. Chairman, before we move on, I had one point of clarification I feel needs clarified before we move on, if that's okay. Louis, again, I just want to make clear that it has nothing to do with churches in general. It's this specific location and the specific zoning that this parcel is under relative to the sign variance that's being discussed. The only other consideration to compare these against are the only other parcels around town that have other signs of a similar nature, which some are churches and some are other businesses. The other church that you talked about, are you speaking of the one on the North Main Street side of town over by Croton Road? Which other church are you talking about? The one on Mink Street. They don't have have an internally illuminated sign. So I don't I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah, that was my point. It's not really a comparable.
I'd be
any problem with credit toward the rezoning application. I think that's fine. I think it's a good call out. It makes sense. It's still residential. Right now, it's residential along with that side of the street, but like I said, when you talk about zoning changes, you also take into account adjacent properties. And you've got on the other side of that street there, that corner that is in the township, on the other side of Concord, it's zoned commercial. So, yeah, there would be a robust discussion with respect to the future land use map for that particular parcel, but it sounds like there'd be justification for it.
Second, you don't have one?
Yes.
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 And if I can make a clarification, we are still moving forward with a refund or a credit toward the future application for rezoning. Yes, we did decide on.
I'm sorry, was that directed at me? Yes. Yeah, so number one, I agree with Bailey's interpretation in terms of the phased approach. Mostly because the automatic reverter provisions are a gray area in zoning law because it's a zoning change that's not necessarily requested by the owner. Number two, as I read as I read the provision, it states that 2 years, if no construction has begun in 2 years, the application may be revoked. So it's not a mandatory revocation in this case. And so based on and again, I don't have the history of this, but based on the phased approach and based on what's before us here today, I don't think that provision necessarily automatically triggers a revocation of the PUD. Mr.
Go ahead, yes.
I'm sorry, just, I'll throw out a comment and then we can continue the discussion, but I obviously have, and many of us don't know the total history behind this piece of property. And I have not had an opportunity to do that due diligence. So to the extent that the commission would like some further due diligence on that and how these provisions apply to this request, I think a tabling may be appropriate for me to work with staff to investigate that a little bit further and to be better prepared to kind of put a finer touch on some of these points and issues. But just throwing that out there, but I think it'd be a good idea to have some discussion in anyways.
Yeah. Go ahead. I was just gonna, Yaz kind of was on the same path that I have been thinking, because the history of it is what is confusing, because I think the history of it, the genesis of this whole thing, is going to inform how this discussion moves forward. If there's an already accepted preliminary plat from 2004 that's 300 some odd parcels, I'd like to see it. I'd like to understand it, and I'd like to know how it compares to what's being presented now. If pieces were sold off in the interim from the time that plat was approved, it obviously wasn't finalized in its final form, because there isn't anything platted for these 64 acres now. But I think that question lends itself to further deliberation, because it's just that there's a lot of uniqueness that goes along with this property, with not having a single owner developer, pieces of it being sold off and plotted out separately, and lot sizes being increased over the years for what certain builders have. It's a unique situation, I think, because of the timing of it. And I think that uniqueness demands some due diligence with respect to a staff report about impact that we've had with previous types of considerations for these types of proposals. Because at this point, I think all of my questions could probably be at least informed from what that would provide, be it water, sewer, expected density increase to the schools, usable open space. I will continue to call that out every single time these types of proposals are brought up, as you can have open space on paper as a reserve or green space, but if it's not usable, I don't know how much you count it towards open space, because it's just, it's a tree bank that no one can do anything with. Lift station upgrades. I'd say maybe one of my biggest call outs right now is the frontage for some of these parcels are drastically under what our lowest minimum is at 55 feet. I see some of these parcels have 37-foot frontages, which don't meet even the minimum requirement of a UR district, which I get is the point of a PUD, but I think, again, you've got to take some conformity of the area into account and not just maybe put a lot where a lot can be just for the sake of putting in a lot. So I think there are other considerations that need to be taken into account, but first and foremost for me is I need to understand the genesis of how we got from, pre-2004 to now, so I can contextualize the entirety of this project. I don't know how to interpret it at the moment, other than asking those general questions and asking for more information on the history. That's me.
I agree with Ben again. I think we need to see the original plat and see what is different now. Especially concerned with the 55-foot lots. I know we did that down in the neo-traditional area down there, but again, that area had alleys. What's being proposed here doesn't have alleys, and yet it's the 55-foot width. So we have to see what was originally approved back in 2004 or whatever. At least I do before we can move forward. At least I can move forward. I've got a list of questions on this plat, but it's no use going through those until we see the original plat, I don't think.
Mr. Chairman, just to Louis' point and just to add on to it, since Yaz is on here too, that's part of what my concern and thought process has been is relative to the PUD designation and the 2.5 years, because the PUD, at least the way that I read our zoning code, isn't necessarily a zoning district in and of itself, but it's an agreed upon deviation from a standard district, to which are laid out as SR1, SR2, UR1, UR2, GCC, etc. And it's an agreed upon standard deviation from it's an agreed upon deviation from a standard district. So it's not necessarily a district in and of itself, unless it was carried over from one iteration to another in some respect. And that's where, when I read the PUD piece, the burden of proof is on the applicant to discuss as to why that PUD promotes the general health and welfare of the community above and beyond what that standard district would provide otherwise. Looking at 1179.04 in our final development plan piece, it does talk about the 2.5 years, and that's where understanding the genesis of this whole ownership of this entire project is of great interest, in my opinion, is because if a plat wasn't applied for a portion under a new owner, then does that qualify it to revert back to its original designation after 2.5 years? Because I see, Gaz, where you talk about, it may be revoked, but right before that it says, if the clearly state that the permit shall expire and may be revoked. The shall to me is absolute, and I don't know what the difference or add-on would be if it were also revoked in addition to expiring. So I think there's a lot of upfront questions that have to be answered to. Yeah, go ahead, Yaz.
Yeah, and Ben, I think I also missed another. There's a more specific expiration provision, and that's 1179.08, which does say shall. So just wanted to clarify my statement earlier.
Yeah, it moves us, it's incumbent on us to review and to deliberate all of these types of developments that come to the village. And nothing against any of those. This to me is more of a historical check and a process defining piece that we need to look at before we review this again. So to me, other than some of the specifics that I called out earlier, I think that we just need that historical approach to set the baseline to give us that context to further move forward. Mr. Chairman? Hey, Ryan, real quick, before you take the second, can I ask a question? In the interest of satisfying Mr. Simonella's request for some specific feedback, I do have some specific items that I can share relative to at least the drawing that we have here, to put them out there to give maybe some other context to continue to work on between now and when we hear it again, with the staff pulls together. So I think that might be appropriate if anybody else has any items, but I can certainly start us off if that's appropriate. Okay, do you want to take a second and then move forward with the comments before the vote? Okay, well, to that end, you made the motion. I'll go ahead and second the table request, and then I can move into my list. So, Mr. Seminello, just some items that I saw that I can bring up. Some of them we've talked about, but just to stress their importance, I'll reiterate again. The traffic study, the ingress egress, is an excellent point. The traffic study on Concord for the light there, I think, is going to be imperative to have that discussion around, because I don't think there's any denying that 174 homes with one proposed ingress and egress is going to be sufficient. I feel like I need to be proved otherwise, just because I can't envision where it would work well. But regardless, if Concord is going to be that main thoroughfare, then I think that conversation needs to happen. To Bailey's point with water and sewer, I had a lot of questions about water and sewer capacity, where these homes, these proposed number of homes would put us relative to our current and, what we have already in agreement with other public-private partnerships, the village, where this would put us from a capacity standpoint. Whether or not lift stations would need to be upgraded, and who would pay for that. I would assume maybe with this type of development that new ones might have to be put in. I'm not sure. I talked about open space. I see the reserve notation, and I think that's great. Green space is great. I'll continue to hammer home my desire to make sure that the green space as it's provided is usable, and not just seen from a distance, but that it can be enjoyed. It's open green space. It's maintained in some capacity, probably by an HOA, and that with 174 homes moving into this space, I would think maybe a playground might be sufficient for families that may be moving into that area. So I would hope that that kind of consideration would be given as well. You talked about conformity to UR2, and I would again be curious to understand the logic behind the deviations from the street frontage requirements that UR2 has. Some of these I think are really small. One of them in the second piece, I think the larger parcel has a street frontage of 32 feet relative to our 55-foot requirement. So, sure. Okay. There's a lot of numbers on the map, so if I overlook something and 55 is the minimum, then I think that that is a good baseline to work off of, and that would be great. So that would be a really good oversight on my end if that's the case. So if 55 is the minimum, I think that's good. Um, uh, sure, I've more call out, but go ahead. Sure. No, that's perfect. That's good. That's the kind of the feedback that I'd like to hear with respect to that open space, just knowing how big of an impact 174 homes would have. So if that improvement on what's already there is a part of it, then I think we just need to make sure that that narrative is also supported on any future discussions or documentation to continue to lend that context to make sure that we understand the total impact. If if this entire Concord East development is being viewed as a total project, then we need to make sure to take the total project into consideration. Um, last two things here. On the northern border, I would just want to ensure that it is brought to your attention the buffering aspect, because those homes would be buffered against an active industrial and manufacturing zoned space, with some call outs relative to some noise over there that the village is continuing to work with those business owners on mitigating. But I do not want to overlook the buffering piece of it, to make sure that, those lots as they're sold, those potential home buyers are given adequate space against that non similar type of zoning. And then the last piece, probably one of the biggest pieces, and I think Marvin alluded to it a little bit, is the stormwater piece. We have a stormwater management program, and we know, absolutely know, that over in that area, stormwater management is of paramount concern because of how the water flows through the village and in that particular part of the village to, down to Concord Road, et cetera. The village has already put in some mitigation projects to help alleviate that, but it's more downstream at this point to where the stormwater management plan would hopefully affect that upstream piece. So as the development of these parcels are being looked at, they, in my mind, are key to the stormwater management of really a large portion of this side of town. And so I don't know if I can reiterate that enough to make sure, borings, compaction analysis, when the streets, may be turned over to the village, just ensuring that the stormwater management piece is taken well into account, because we know how these parcels factor into that overall process. So I think that's all I have for now, but I wanted to put those out there to kind of give some more food for thought. I appreciate your consideration. I appreciate the dialogue and the feedback as well.
I've got a couple if you got a minute. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry about that. Easiest to hardest, I guess. On the lot numbering, there's quite a bit of confusion. There's lots 1 through 11 in the old section, and then in the proposed, there's a lot 1 through 11. If we could get the engineers to clear that up, because it would get very confusing. We're having the same lot number. I know these are preliminary or temporary lot numbers. I would be very concerned with the 55-foot lots. Most of the lots in the existing built section are the 70-foot. The ones that are 55 are in the neo-traditional. And it seems like a whole bunch of the lots in the northeast corner there are all the 55-foot. The other concern I have is in Reserve B up in the northwest corner, that's inaccessible. So I don't know if that could really be used for anything. And then the other item I had of concern, I like how the end of Cannondale, the cul-de-sac is connected into the walking path. There might be some consideration also, because I believe that's right over by where the Mammoth area is. Is there any consideration for connecting the other cul-de-sac right there, the DeRosa, also to the walking path? And yeah, the far northwest cul-de-sac, Cannondale Avenue, is connected into the walking path, which is great. But the adjacent cul-de-sac might be considered, you might consider connecting that into the walking path also. And I think the only other one I had, I get my computer to behave. We talked about having the 176 lots or 74 lots emptying into the single entry. We also have to include all the existing houses that are there. So it's going to be well over 200 lots, 200 houses when it's finished out that are going to be emptying out onto that one egress onto Concord. It's not just the 175. That's what I had.
I might throw out just a word of caution with the connections to the bike path. Correct me if I'm wrong, but previous discussions have brought up that we as a village aren't necessarily the ones that grant that approval to connect to the bike path. Because it is the TJ Evans path, we have an agreement from a maintenance standpoint. And usage of it, it is within the village. But would want to make sure that those greater permissions are received to connect to that path. Because I wouldn't want the village to be the ones that say yes when they're not further approved. So just wanted to put that out there. Ron, I don't disagree with your call out necessarily, but would just want to make sure that other permissions are given.
Yeah, no, I'm on. I had to. My uh, virtual was freezing, so I had to jump on my phone. So I apologize. Um, yeah, 79 or 17908 does say that there's an automatic reverter after 2.5 years of not construction.
Yes.
Yes.
Correct.
I'd be okay with that, Chairman Green. Just advance notification as much as possible.
Yeah, I'm on board. We've put enough time into the design guidelines. I think we're getting close. And we've put a tremendous amount of time over several years into this zoning code update. And anything that we can do to get to a resolution is only going to be beneficial. You'd have to combine lots at that point. I mean, I think for me, for a lot of the space, it's making sure that there's compatibility between, you know, the residences that may be here as well as the residential offices that may be abutting these parcels. So I think it's 1805E where it talks about lighting and knowing that we've had complaints over there or concerns brought up already about some of the lighting, that I would want to make sure that we would emphasize down lighting and or motion sensor in the evening, just to help eliminate some of the potential light pollution that may be happening with businesses that operate, you know, after dusk and things like that. Then the signage for me is at 12 square feet. I had marked 10 square feet. And I don't have a reference as to why, but I would assume it's to make it similar to what we already have on the books in that space. I don't know offhand though. But just making sure signage isn't a prominent feature down there in that space. There's still some semblance of residential atmosphere.
Yeah. Hey guys, I don't have the whole thing, all the text in front of me, but one thought I thought what was to put a consideration for traffic in there. Um, just depending on where the lot situates on 62 or even Main Street, where we have some of these parcels in mind, I think traffic's going to be, you know, fitting in with the traffic pattern and the traffic necessities, you know, of the business. You know, if it's a daycare, they might have a lot of people coming in and out at certain times. I think it should be a consideration on the zone, on determination if that's an appropriate zoning for that parcel. That's my thought. Gotcha. Okay. Thank you, Bailey.
Is there a reason we would take two-family attached dwellings out but leave in bed and breakfast establishments? Is a conditional use. I just, I mean, it talks about structures maintaining the appearance of a single family. I just think we can keep family attached dwellings, because I think there's justification already for it. If we want to put some caveat or make it conditional, or the caveat be that it maintain, the semblance of a single family like we do for bed and breakfast, I just would think that there would be some continuity we'd want to tie between those two. That's all. I would just, I would suggest putting two family attached dwellings as the conditional. I wouldn't take it out altogether.
Yeah, I agree.
Give somebody an opportunity to state their argument. Yeah, to Jim Blair's point, a lot of these discussions about allowable uses, we may be coming back to with some of these districts, just because when we get to the parking requirements piece, we're probably just going to have a lot of discussion around, how to figure in that formula for parking requirements. Hopefully at that point, we'll be in a better position with respect to, understanding an overall, transportation or mobility plan that may factor into the overall discussion. But parking is just like signage. I think I said it before. It's going to be a long discussion about what that perfect formula is, which is going to influence how a lot of these, parcels may develop within a residential office type zoning district. Yeah, there's probably some discussion with this. I think there's a couple of parcels that, since we've discussed, have been rezoned now to, a village commercial, I think, from what this pulls from, like the parcel just to the east of the new Johnstown Point was recently changed, I think, to village commercial, which should probably be limited business in this respect.
So do you think it should be smaller, Ryan? You think it should be smaller, less than 5,000?
Bailey, to answer your question, the lot area for village commercial has no minimum, but it does say no land may be subdivided or combined into lots greater than a half an acre. So you can't break it down, and if something is, an acre, you can't go 3/4 and a quarter, or it can't be built up to anything bigger than a half an acre, 21,800 or so square feet.
I agree.
How big is the nursing home or the Johnstown Point? I can't recall. $80,000? I mean, I know obviously it's a much larger parcel that it's on, but yeah.
Would that be? That's not what we envision being this zoning in this type of part. Okay. So my thought was, okay, if one of the types of businesses that we're trying to encourage, or one of the types of looks, was the um, was a type of building that's built from boundary to boundary and made walkable from the street with a, like we talked about, like having a setback that was just with like concrete 25-foot setback with paved all the way that we talked about in our design review. If that was going to be the type of building, and you bought one of these lots and you wanted to build it out lot line to lot line, what kind of a square footage would you need? So if that's one of the types of buildings that we think is appropriate for this type of zoning, we wouldn't want to seclude that as one of our options, right? Um, Obviously, it'd probably be one floor. It wouldn't have to be huge depth, but what is that? What are the typical lot lines over there? Is that going to preclude a lot too much? That type of building structure across the board. You see where I'm trying to go with that? Bailey, what's your thoughts on that? Do you kind of agree? Because you kind of had the same vision on some of those businesses that I did from our discussion, the design review. I don't want to cut that out of the plan just yet. Well, it sounds like we're all in agreement then with 25. Set it and move on.
Have have we firmed up those definitions? I couldn't recall. I know there was some question about them before. I think it was discussed that you can't exclude them, but I think some kind of conversation around if you had one, then you had to have the other in some capacity. I can't recall where we landed with it. You're exactly right. Yep, we did class one, type A and B as conditional under urban residential. You're right.
This seems to be the best place for the type 2 of all the new districts, limited districts.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense for all four of these to be included here. I think the way they're listed, I think makes sense. Class one, type A and B, and class two, type A and B. Jim, what did you say? 300 is the exact seating capacity of which church? For the parking and loading, I know it was a 20.04.10. It talks about the subjective arrangement so as to maximize the visual and functional impacts of business-related parking on any adjacent districts zoned for single-family residences. Do we think it might be applicable in this space to either designate or strongly encourage rear or side loading for these spaces? Or do we feel like it's subjective enough that whomever feels like they want to develop and have parking in the front will do so in a manner that preserves the visual and functional impact of business-related parking on the adjacent parcels?
Yeah, good idea.
Yes.
Okay.
So moved.
Aye.
I
This conference is no longer being recorded.
Have a good evening.
all right. Good night, guys. Thank you.